now given the great privilege of introducing a man for whom I have had tremendous admiration for decades. Ira Glasser is just an amazing individual. I said the other night, I really think it's literally true that Ira has probably had a greater impact in preserving and in some cases expanding the recognized civil liberties that all of us enjoy as Americans under the United States Constitution and Bill of Rights than any other individual I know of. When he came to the ACLU in 1978, it was what some people call a mom and pop operation. It was a small organization. It was focused and based primarily in a few larger cities. It had a budget of about $4 million. By the time he ended his tenure at the ACLU in 2001, literally bringing the group into the 21st century, it had staffed offices in 50 states and the U.S. territories. It had a budget 11 times greater than it did when he became the national executive director of that organization. Now, I want to share with you something that I think is okay for me to share with you, but he told me last night he's only told about a dozen people the story. I said to him, how do you go from being a math student, and he was pursuing a PhD in mathematics and teaching mathematics back in the mid-70s. So how do you go from that to being a full-time civil libertarian? And what he told me is that it was an encounter with Bobby Kennedy, that he was applying to work on Kennedy's presidential campaign staff, and Kennedy said to him, you know, what are you going to do if you don't come to work for me? He said, well, I got an offer from the ACLU, but I don't really want to work for those people. You know, he said, I want to work about things I care about, I'm passionate about. He said, you work for the ACLU and you will deal with all those things, and that certainly turned out to be the case. Ira Glasser is an amazing individual. He has, since retiring from the ACLU, and retire is really the wrong term, he has been the president of the board of the Drug Policy Alliance. And the Drug Policy Alliance is, without question, the most influential, the most powerful, the most effective drug reform organization in America. Please welcome Mr. Ira Glasser.
So now Bobby's secret is out, huh? It was his fault. Something happened in 1968, as Radley indicated. In 1968, there were fewer than 200,000 people in prison in this country, both state and federal, for all crimes. And not many of them were for drug offenses, because we're talking all crimes. Rape, kidnapping, assault, murder. Fewer than 200,000 people in prison, in all state and federal prisons, for all crimes in 1968. This began to change very shortly after, in 70 and 71, 73 especially, and it grew enormously, and then got kick-started in 1980 again. And by the end of the 20th century, only some 32 years after 68, that number of fewer than 200,000 had grown to 2.4 million. And there was another interesting thing about that growth. The racial disparity between the numbers of blacks and Latinos who were among those 2.4 million had doubled from the percentages when it was around 200,000. So you had a growth from 200,000 to 2.4 million, and a doubling of the proportions of people of color in those prisons. Now, let me just ask you to freeze frame that beginning of the film while I do what in the movies they call a flashback. And I want to flashback because what I want to try to do here is create a context historically, and I want to answer the question, or try to, about why did that happen? What was the social function of that expansion and that shift in the racial demographics? And what is it now? Understanding it doesn't mean we're going to automatically resolve it, but not understanding it means we will have very little chance of resolving it. So I want to try to create that context and connect the dots of a lot of what has been said here all during the day. So let me go back to the 18th century. I used to be fond of saying that the ACLU was the most conservative organization in America because I didn't know who else was running around loose trying to conserve the original values of the Bill of Rights, and you couldn't get more conservative than that. Whenever somebody tells you they're a conservative, it's important for you to ask what exactly is it that they're trying to conserve. And it's a very misused word. What we were trying to conserve was the Bill of Rights, and that started back in the 18th century with certain glaring exceptions that I think are connected directly to what we're dealing with today. You know, in around 1760 or so, well before the American Revolution, the colonists were basically British citizens who had come here and beaten back the native population that they found, and had created colonies pretty much on the eastern seaboard from the north to the south. And they were sort of living as British subjects. And Britain was, the British Parliament was enacting more and more repressive laws and sending British soldiers over to enforce them, and it was really beginning to get irritating. And one of the most irritating things, what the second president, John Adams, later said in his memoirs, decades and decades after his retirement from politics, was that the general searches that the British constables did in the colonies was the most important spark to the revolution. And what that was were what were called general searches, where British constables would come into your house at will. You might, if you were a modern person, have called them a no-knock raid. But there were no warrants. There was no reason that they had to have. There was no judicial approval that they had to have. They just came in whenever they felt like it and tore up the furniture with their bayonets, looking for contraband or violations of the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act got people very irritated. That was a few years later in 1765, where the British Parliament passed a law that said that every piece of paper that was used by the colonists had to have an official stamp on it, which cost money. That included newspapers, books, so it affected speech, and the colonists hated this. They hated those taxes, they hated the Stamp Act, and they most of all hated the idea of British constables coming into their house and rummaging around and looking through the footlockers and all the other things. Now, in those days, there being no internet and no insurance companies and no credit card companies and no banks and, you know, to speak, I mean, everything of importance, all the records of importance were kept at home in your footlocker. And so that's what the British constables used to like to come in and search. It happened to almost everybody. It's fair to say there was not a colonist in America in that time who didn't have the experience or who didn't know somebody very close to them who had had the experience of having these intrusive searches all the time. Now, if that's beginning to sound like what black folks say about the experience of being stopped in cars and stopped and frisked and all of that, that no black person has ever been free from those experiences or from knowing somebody close to them who had those experiences, not once, not twice, many times. The rage and the anger and the resentment that is rampant within minority communities in this country over that tactic was exactly the rage that was rampant among all the colonists in Britain, in America, over the British searches in the middle of the 18th century. The difference is that it was happening to everybody. So everybody, so it was a political issue. In the United States, it's only happening to them over there, and we over here, for a long time, didn't even know about it, much less get excited about it. I grew up in the middle of Manhattan. Rather, I grew up in Brooklyn. I lived in the middle of Manhattan with my kids. And all four of them were out in the streets of Manhattan, going to subways and going to public schools. And during the 70s, at least three of them for sure. I keep meaning to ask the fourth about her. But at least three of them smoked weed in the 1970s. Never once did a cop stop them on the street. They didn't just not frisk them, not search them, not harass. They never stopped them. And you know, we didn't live in a high-income neighborhood. We lived in Lower Manhattan, Chelsea, and it was you know, a middle-class to lower middle-class neighborhood. And they never got stopped. I used to be terrified that they would get stopped. I used to tell them, you know, you got to be very careful how you get the weed and from whom you get it. And I would like you to bring it home and smoke it here or at your friend's house. Don't do it on the street, because if the cops ever figured out whose son you were, you know, we're all going to have a lot of trouble. But nobody ever stopped them, and nobody ever stopped any of their friends, except their black friends. That happened. And so when somebody at an earlier panel said that this is really, we shouldn't be talking about race all the time, because you know, the real principle is don't stop and frisk anybody. And the question is, there's a reason why the cops don't stop and frisk folks on the west side of Manhattan. If they went in illegally to any random apartment on the west side of Manhattan and opened up the freezer, they would find more weed than they find in 10 years of frisking black kids in Harlem or in Bed-Stuy or in the South Bronx. They don't do that, and they don't stop their kids on the street, and they never will. And the reason they never will is if they did, it would last politically for 10 minutes. It would never be tolerated for the same reason that the searches in the colonies in the mid-18th century weren't tolerated. But if you just do it to a pariah class, if you do it to people of color, if you do it to people that the majority white community is afraid of and has been taught to be afraid of, and if you keep that a secret from the larger community, you can do it pretty much forever. And that's why it happens. So in 1968, suddenly the prison population jumps from 200,000 to 2.4 million, and the shift in the composition of that prison population, the proportions of blacks and to some extent Latinos doubles from what it was previously. Okay, so we go back now to our flashback, and it's 1761, and the colonists are up in arms about these general searches, and they actually hire a lawyer named James Otis to file a lawsuit in Boston, I think, someplace in Massachusetts. Now, of course, there was no constitution then. This was before the Revolution. But he files a lawsuit on the basis of British law and challenges these searches. And he doesn't win. But the case becomes a celebrated case. And as John Adams says years later, decades later in his memoirs, Otis was a flame of fire, and Adams regarded that case and that issue as the spark that led directly to the revolution 15 years later. So they fight the war, and of course 1776, before what kicked off the revolution, was the Declaration of Independence, which was written by Thomas Jefferson and signed by many others, political leaders of that day. And the Declaration of Independence, in its key paragraphs, says that all people are endowed by the Creator with fundamental rights that no government can take away. This is an endowment from God. That was what the Declaration said. And all men are equal. Everybody has these rights. And that governments, and that the Declaration is an indictment of the British Crown for systematically violating those rights. And the Declaration goes on to say, Jefferson goes on to say, that the purpose of government, that governments are created, are instituted in order to protect those rights, not to take them away. And that becomes the rallying cry that starts the revolution. After the revolution is won, they have to sit down and try to create a government and a system. And of course, the thing that nobody ever talked about, this is the generation that fought the revolution. They'll stop at nothing. This is the government that fought a revolution for liberty, for the liberty and sanctity of your home, for the liberty not to be taxed without representation, for the liberty to have a say politically in the decisions that affect your life and not be ruled by some far-off parliament in England. For basic fundamental rights. That was the purpose of government, said the Declaration. This was the only generation, this is probably the only generation in the history of the United States that was against illegal searches, because they were all victims of it. And this generation that fought a revolution and started a nation dedicated to the principles of liberty, and because of their grievances about the violations of those principles, this liberty generation harbored slavery. You will not see the word slavery in the United States Constitution. But Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, who said that all men are created equal, who said that everyone has rights endowed by God that no government can take away, who said that governments are instituted to protect these rights, was a slave owner. And so were they all. Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death," but he didn't include the slaves. And this was a contradiction in the midst of the creation of the country. It was the very soul of the country. That constitutes, in my way of thinking, what in Catholic doctrine is called original sin. Slavery was America's original sin. It stained our bones and polluted our blood and became ingrained in the DNA of the country's political culture. And I don't think we've ever been able to get rid of it. And the founding generation of this country, despite the fact that they stood for liberty and that one of their first acts when they constructed the new government was to pass the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that guaranteed freedom of speech and freedom of religion and a fair trial and protected against the kind of searches that the British constables did by saying that the cops couldn't search without a reason and that the reason had to be approved by a judge, that the cops couldn't decide for themselves because they would always decide that this was a good thing to go in, and so you had to go get permission from a third party, which was a judicial warrant. And this generation that did all of that we learned in school, that's what America was about. That was the difference between our system and the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany or whatever. This was America, I learned as a child in school. But right in the middle of that was the greatest, most brutal, most severe deprivation of liberty imaginable, which was slavery. Now, you have to ask yourself, how do people live with that? They were not unaware of it. If you read the pamphlets of the American Revolution, you find lots of pamphlets screaming and yelling about the immorality of slavery and that we cannot go forward in a fight for liberty against Britain when we harbor in our own midst this gross denial of liberty, where people were brought over in chains and subjected to whippings and lynchings and forced labor and bred like cattle, and where families were bought and sold and separated, and where women were used like cows to milk the children of their owners. There was probably never a more sustained, more brutal form of slavery than the one that we harbored. You could not imagine a greater deprivation of liberty. And this wasn't just for a few years. This started in 1619. So by the time we fight the revolution and we fight for liberty, we're talking about 250 years. When something like that happens and is sustained, and people have to live with it and somehow justify it while they are preachers for the principles of liberty, it corrupts them. It corrupts them in their soul. It makes slavery normal. And if you have a belief, as the founding generation of this country had, that all men were created equal and everybody was endowed by God with fundamental rights that no government could take away, and in the midst you were dealing with millions of black folks whose liberty you were taking away, there could be only one way you could reconcile that. And that is, if all people are created equal and endowed by God with certain fundamental rights, and we were denying it to these folks, it must be that they're not human. And that rationale got written in to the bones and blood of our culture. And everybody lived with it. Everybody knew it. You know, I was 7 years old when World War II ended, and the question that was everywhere on the lips of everybody is, what do the ordinary Germans know about what the Nazis did to the Jews? And of course, more of them knew than admitted it. They knew that their neighbors were disappearing and not coming back. They saw what the Gestapo did. But a lot of them probably didn't know. But everybody knew what was going on in America in the 18th century about slavery. And everybody knew the brutality under which those people were being forced to live. And the only way it could be rationalized by people who fundamentally fought for and believed in basic rights and basic liberties was that these people weren't really human. Now, of course, that founding generation did the same thing with Native Americans. And to some extent, they even did it with women, since women didn't have the right to vote or make contracts or anything else. And they even did it with ordinary working people, because the only people who had the right to vote at the time the country was founded was people who owned property. So there were a lot of exceptions to these principles of liberty, but skin color was the biggest one. And this was so ingrained in the political culture that in 1857, the Supreme Court decides, in the only case in which the Supreme Court ever ruled on the constitutionality of slavery, the case you all know about, right down the road, Dred Scott. Dred Scott and his wife and his children are taken out of the South by their owner to a state that didn't have slavery. Not originally Missouri, it was a different state, but it eventually ended up here. And then the question was, did he have to be returned when the owner basically let him go? And the law was, yes, he had to be returned, and he had to be returned to slavery. And so somehow he finds a lawyer to challenge that, and the case goes up to the United States Supreme Court. And in 1857, the court rules 7-2 against Dred Scott. And the only case that the Supreme Court of the United States has ever ruled on the constitutionality of slavery, it rules that slavery is constitutional. But the ruling is not really the full outrage. If you read the opinion, which nobody in school is ever asked to do, I certainly never was when I was in school. If you read the opinion, Chief Judge Roger Taney has in the key paragraph of this decision the following language as a justification for holding slavery to be constitutional and for ordering Dred Scott back to the southern state from which he came. He writes, blacks are not citizens, blacks have no rights which whites are bound to respect. Blacks have no rights which whites are bound to respect. This is the Chief Judge of the United States Supreme Court, 7-2. Only 2 dissents from that decision. And this becomes accepted. Nobody is up in arms about it. You know, it does spark a lot of opposition among abolitionists of slavery, but by and large, it describes the political culture. Blacks have no rights which whites are bound to respect. Never mind what the Declaration of Independence says, never mind what the Constitution says in the Bill of Rights, blacks have no rights which whites are bound to respect. So slavery gets institutionalized and becomes normal for everybody. It's something we live with, and it doesn't change our view of ourselves. When I learned about American democracy in school, up in Brooklyn and New York, and in the 40s and 50s, in elementary school and junior high school and high school, I learned about America's freedoms. I learned about democracy and liberty and the Bill of Rights and why that made us a better country than the Soviet Union, and why we fought Nazi Germany over issues of liberty, over whether they could exterminate 6 million people because of their religion, and that was a war against racism. That was what we were told. Meanwhile, there was this thing in the United States that sort of didn't count. And the only way it didn't count is if you somehow came to just assume was normal that blacks weren't really human beings. Because if they were, you couldn't be doing what you're doing to them and still go on thinking of ourselves as a nation of individual rights and liberties. So, 4 or 5 years after the Dred Scott decision, there's the Civil War. And by the end of the Civil War, slavery was dead, over, finished. And after the Civil War, Lincoln and the Republicans in the Congress managed to pass 3 more amendments to add to the original 10. The 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery, the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed everybody living everywhere in the United States the same rights that the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, had, and the 15th Amendment, which prohibited racial discrimination in voting. Well, this was an explosion in the middle of the Deep South, which at the time constituted the majority of states in the country. And it didn't take long to unravel those decisions. The 13th Amendment had one exception to it. It prohibited slavery and involuntary servitude unless you were convicted of a crime. And all over the South, there were explosions of new laws, new criminal laws, that targeted only blacks. And imprisonment and felony convictions started to rise in the South. And that, of course, subjected blacks to involuntary servitude on chain gangs, and it barred them from all kinds of employment and all the rest. But they also did something else. They invented something else right after the Civil War to accompany that, and that is something called felony disenfranchisement, in which the states of the South said if you've been convicted of a felony, you lose your right to vote. So if you were convicted of a crime, no matter how trumped up it was, no matter how trivial it was, and you came out after the crime, you lost your right to vote. And what that did is that blew out the 15th Amendment guarantee of the right to vote, because this was only enforced against black folks. But it didn't affect all that many people outside the Deep South, because the numbers were small. And this goes, and then of course they pass immediately, the Supreme Court offers another decision which eviscerates the 14th Amendment and says states are not bound to give people the rights that are guaranteed in the first 10, no matter what the 14th Amendment says. The Supreme Court does that in 1873, and after that, the states of the South are free to reinstitute subjugation of black folks, and they do it through things like the black codes and the early Jim Crow laws. And what the black codes did is they said, if you have even one drop of black blood, you're a black. Of course, blacks were beginning to have different colors. They weren't as dark as the Africans were when they were brought over. A lot of them were lighter skinned. Where do you suppose that lighter skin came from? It came from rapes by white owners. That's where it came from. You know, somewhere in Neil Franklin's past, there were relatives, there were women, ancestors of his, who were raped. That's why his skin is lighter than the Africans who were kidnapped and brought over here. And of course, the South had to deal with that. So the way they dealt with it is they said, if you have, you know, one drop, which means if one of your great-great-great-grandparents was black, you were black too. No matter how you looked, no matter, you know. That enabled them to do all the other things that the black codes did. They barred blacks from learning, from being taught how to read or write. They barred employment other than agricultural employment because they needed people to pick cotton, and now that they didn't have the slaves, they had to force the same people who used to be the slaves to have no other options but to do the same jobs that they did as slaves. They separated people in every way through the Jim Crow laws. They separated people in drinking fountains, in bathrooms, in swimming pools, in ball fields, in restaurants and hotels, and you know the whole story. And what the black codes and what Jim Crow laws were a successor system of separation and racial subjugation now that they didn't have slavery anymore. That's what they were. And they stayed that way for 100 years. I grew up with it when I was a kid, although I didn't know much about it. I'll tell you how I found out about separate restaurants and separate hotels in this country. It wasn't from school. It was when I was 9 and 10 years old, and I was listening on the radio. Nobody had televisions then. I was listening on the radio to the broadcast of the Brooklyn Dodger baseball games. I was from Brooklyn. They were my team, and of course they had a black ball player in 1947 in Jackie Robinson, and it was the first time that had ever happened. And then they had a couple of others in 49 and in 50. And I'm listening to the radio, and I find out that when the Dodgers come to St. Louis, they're not allowed to stay at the same hotel as the rest of the team, those 3 black ball players. And they're not allowed to eat at the same restaurants with their team, that they have to be somewhere else. And that's how I find out about Jim Crow laws and segregated public accommodations. And that's how I came to hate it. Not because I had a great sense of morality, but because I was taught this in public schools, or because my parents told me it was wrong. It was because these were my guys, you know. And I always remember that when I come to St. Louis. This is 1949, 1950 I'm talking about. And so these kinds of racial subjugations and separating people on the basis of skin color and making them second, third, fourth, fifth class citizens and subjugating them and tyrannizing them was a successor system to slavery. It was what was done after slavery was not any longer permitted. And this continued, as I say, for 100 years. After World War II, things began to change a little bit. In 1947, the owner of the Dodgers hires Robinson. No court asked him to do it. No legislature forced him to do it. He wasn't a public official. He just did it. And it became a national passion play. Everybody saw it every day. It wasn't something that you were forced to read about in your civics books. It was something that you saw every day. And for those of us living in Brooklyn who were Dodger fans, it enabled us, particularly the white boys, of identifying with a black man's struggle for justice, because this was our team. And in those days, if you went around the borough of Brooklyn, you could find white kids like me all over the place, copying Jackie Robinson's stance and the way he held the bat, the way he danced off first base and third base. He, on a team of heroes, he was our #1 hero. Not because it was a civil rights issue, but because he was the most exciting ball player we had ever saw, and he was ours. And the Yankees, they didn't have any black players. They were one of the last teams to get a black player. They were even later than the Cardinals. And I often said if I had been a Yankee fan, I probably would have grown up as a racist. Instead, I learned about racial oppression in America. I learned about Jim Crow laws. I learned to hate it, and I learned to identify with the struggle against it at a time when I was 9 or 10 years old, and it couldn't have gotten into my head any other way. And it didn't just get into my head; it got into my guts. It got into my heart. It got into the same place that slavery had gotten into in all those prior generations. And when I came to the ACLU years later, I found that almost all the men who worked there, who were about my age, were Dodger fans. There were no Yankee fans who worked at the ACLU. And I thought it was, a joke. I thought it was just, I used to do a little stand-up routine about it. That Dodger fans grew up to believe in civil rights and civil liberties, and Yankee fans grew up to believe in oil depletion allowances. And it turned out like most satires of reality, it was true. And so in 1947, the first great civil rights event of the post-war world is Robinson breaking the color line in baseball. The next year, in 1948, President Truman signs an order desegregating the armed forces. We were fighting a war for liberty against Nazism, against religious oppression, against racism. That's what we were told. And we were fighting it with a segregated army. Truman ends that in 1948. 2 years later, a then unknown lawyer for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund named Thurgood Marshall files a lawsuit in South Carolina to challenge the segregation of public schools. And 4 years after that, in 1954, a surprisingly unanimous Supreme Court rules in favor of Marshall's arguments and strikes down school segregation as unconstitutional. And 2 years after that, 1 year after that, Rosa Parks sits down in that bus in Montgomery, and an unknown black Baptist preacher named Martin Luther King, 28 years old, stands up and organizes a boycott on her behalf, and the civil rights movement is underway. And between 1955 and 1963, there are demonstrations, there are sit-ins, there are fire hoses and cattle prods, and people getting shot, and people getting killed who are working for civil rights. But in 1964, all that comes to fruition with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlaws racial discrimination in public accommodations, meaning swimming pools, water fountains, bathrooms, hotels, restaurants, all that. Outlaws racial discrimination in employment. Outlaws racial discrimination in education with federal funds. A year later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passes, and it prohibits all of the poll taxes and the grandfather clauses and the literacy tests and all those things that the South erected to get in the way of black voting. In 1968, they passed the Fair Housing Act, which outlaws racial discrimination in the rental or sale or purchase of housing. And in those three pieces of legislation between 1964 and 1968, the entire legal infrastructure of Jim Crow is destroyed, and erected in its place is a legal civil rights enforcement structure. And we think that this is finally over, that this nightmare is over. The same way as the folks after slavery, after the Civil War, when they passed the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, they thought that was over. And that takes us to 1968, when, as I said, something happened. And here is what happened, that led to that explosion of incarceration and that shift in the demography of incarceration from white to black. And what happened was the war on drugs. In 1994, H.R. Haldeman publishes his diaries, and he was the chief of staff to Nixon when he got elected in '68. And you remember before previous speaker saying that this started in '68 with the war on drugs. Well, Haldeman publishes his diaries, and he apparently kept close diaries as well as audio tapes of a lot of his private conversations with Nixon. And in one of the diaries, he has Nixon saying, around '68, '69, saying the following: "You know, the real problem in this country is the blacks. And the key to doing something about it is to get people to recognize it without appearing to. To create a system that recognizes that the real problem is blacks without appearing to. And that system was the war on drugs. That is why all of these racial disproportions are not byproducts. They're not side effects. They're not unintended effects. They're not because cops are monsters. They are policy that was intended to be a successor system of separation and subjugation to Jim Crow, just as Jim Crow was a successor system of separation and subjugation to slavery. They are in the long line of our never being able to get rid of that original sin. Now, that may not ever always be in every context the best way to argue against drug prohibition, but that's why everybody who stops and frisks in New York is black. 80% of the people who smoke marijuana in New York are white. 88% of the people who are stopped and frisked and arrested for it are black or Latino. And the numbers have zoomed in the last 15 years from a couple of thousand a year to 50,000 a year. And those 50,000 have come about through 600,000 stop and frisks of black teenagers, kids from 18 to 24, essentially. They never find evidence of a crime. They're not stopping them because they have reasonable suspicion or probable cause. They say that they were stopping them because of weapons. But after they stopped 600,000, they found 1/4% who had weapons. And you're not even legally allowed to frisk unless you have a reasonable suspicion of a weapon, and that has to be based on something that you see, like, you know, a bulge in your pocket. That's what the Supreme Court said in 1968. But in the year 2010, New York City cops were not doing that. They were not told to do that. They were trained. They were told the law was not what the law was, and they cling to that policy. So what you're dealing with at every level here is a reflection of the racial subjugation function of the drug war. It's not that it doesn't affect and injure a lot of whites. It does. But if you look at it proportionately and statistically, it's very clear who the targets are. It's clear, you know, that's where the cops camp out, and that's who they stop, and that's who they frisk. They don't do it to my kids in my neighborhood. They do it up in Harlem. They do it in the South Bronx. They do it in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. And if you're going to fish in waters where the only fish are trout, you shouldn't be surprised if the only fish you catch are trout. And until we come to grips with the morality, the immorality of that function of the war on drugs, all of our arguments about individual liberty and asset forfeiture and illegal searches and all the rest of it is swept aside the way it's always been swept aside in our history by the persistence of race in this country. That is the persistence from which there is a direct line from slavery to the Black Codes to Jim Crow to the war on drugs. And Nixon was a genius. The war on drugs was a system that dealt with the problem of blacks without appearing to. And Reagan kickstarted that in 1980, and that is how we ended up with SWAT teams functioning the way they were in black neighborhoods. That is the way we ended up with an epidemic of stop and frisk. That is the way we ended up with New York City, the most liberal city in the country, being the marijuana capital, marijuana arrest capital of the world. More people have gotten arrested in the last 10 or 15 years for marijuana possession. I'm talking about this much in New York, and only because of illegal searches. Because the New York law since 1977, you can carry up to 25 grams in your pocket, and it's not a crime. So how do the cops find it? They say they were looking for a gun, but 25 grams of marijuana does not look like a gun. You can't do that. They do it by putting their hands in people's pockets. They do it by telling the kids to empty their pockets or they'll be in trouble. And they don't know, so they do. Once it's out of their pockets and in public view, it becomes a misdemeanor. That's how they got all those arrests. So, you know, and if they did that in my neighborhood, to my kids, or anywhere else on the west side of Manhattan, it would become such a political hot potato it couldn't last for 10 minutes. But they don't. And the publicity about it has finally begun to turn it around. But now they have changed their policy in New York, and this is a final point about the limits of decriminalization as opposed to legalization. What they need to do to prevent all of these searches and these illegal arrests is make it legal. But what they've done is to say, we'll make it a violation, you know, like a speeding ticket or a parking ticket. And if we catch you with the 25 grams or less in your pocket, we just write you a ticket. And then it's not a crime. The problem is that nobody's still talking about how are you going to know he's carrying around 20 grams or 10 grams or 5 grams in his pocket without the illegal searches. The new policy doesn't address that. And when you write that ticket, what it's going to end up with is a bench warrant, because those arrests are not going anywhere. And half the kids are not going to come. Or if they have a job, they're not going to put their employment in jeopardy by leaving in the middle of the day for a court appointment. So if they don't show up, then a bench warrant is issued. And if they get arrested, and you heard what Radley was saying about the thousands, the tens of thousands of bench warrants in black communities in Missouri and all over the country, once you end up with that bench warrant, you're a target. And if you get arrested on the bench warrant, you can be put in jail. And so that kind of decriminalization does not address the problem of the police targeting people based on the color of their skin under the current law. Nothing addresses that problem except the kind of laws that were passed in Oregon and Washington and Colorado, and which I hope you will pass here. A few days before he was assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr. Made a speech in Memphis, and he addressed the problem of the fact that he had been making these speeches to black audiences for a decade or more, and people were beginning to say, when is this going to end? When are we going to have justice? And he said, I might not be there with you, but we will get there. I don't think he knew he was going to be killed the next 2 days, but that's what he said. And he answered the question about how long. And he said in a memorable riff of a speech, he said, how long? Not long, because no injustice can last forever. I have a little amendment to that. My amendment is how long? For as long as the rest of us tolerate it, because it isn't happening to us. That is the message of morality that has to be put out there to the American public, because most people don't believe they are racist anymore. And most people don't support what happened in the South in the 40s and 50s and 60s. They don't support it, but what they do support are policies that don't seem to be racist on their face, but are necessarily racist in their effect. And people have got to get that moral message, or I don't think our movement can succeed. Thank you.